something we've been talking about a lot on this podcast is just the decline of the American empire, the fall of the American empire. And I think that's something that resonates with a lot of people. People can see it and understand it. But the thing is, for me, the concept of the American empire is a little vague to me because traditionally, when I look at history books or remember looking at maps in school, I could see the Ottoman Empire, I could see the Roman Empire. But when I look at a world map today or a globe, it just looks like every country is there by itself. There's America and everybody's minding their own business. But clearly that's not the case. So could you just maybe help explain to me and the audience what is the American empire? It doesn't seem to be the traditional type of empire that we have in our mind. I never really thought really of America as an empire when I was a child growing up, but
Right.
now I do.
Yeah, it is not the traditional empire, which is about territory. I mean, we did have some imperial adventures, and we did seize, for example, the Philippines, right, and, a little better than 100 years ago. And that was an imperial holding for a while, but eventually we gave them their independence. So yeah, we don't just conquer territories and rule over them. You could say that we did that on the North American continent, right? But we stopped at the Pacific Ocean, and there was the Philippines, but that was just kind of a detour. The American, you look at the map of the world. Sure, you don't see territorial holdings of the U.S., but there are something like 800 military bases, U.S. military bases around the world, which is far, far more than any other country. Far, far more than Russia or China. I think Russia has like one, in Syria. And China is similar. I think they have one in like Djibouti, someplace like that. I mean, it just... So there is a military presence, a U.S. military presence around the world in a way that no other country has. So that's a military, let's say, dimension of the U.S. empire. But I think the more important one is actually through the financial institutions, particularly SWIFT and the U.S. dollar. So again, like when the U.S. chose to attack Russia, that's how it launched its attack. And it thought that because it was the global hegemon and, in finances, it was going to be able to crush Russia. And now that failed. So it has this economic aspect, this system that was set up towards the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods system, and then, most importantly, the use of the dollar as the world's reserve currency gives them kind of allows them to rule the world, a good part of the global economy. Now it's a shrinking part. At one time, it was almost the entire global economy. And then those bases around the world allow them to project power, through military power throughout the world. Now, again, you look at a map of Europe, and these are all independent countries, right? But we have been talking about how they really aren't. They're vassals. I mean, what kind of country, self-respecting country, allows another country to blow up its, energy infrastructure and doesn't even complain? Of course, I'm talking about Germany and its relationship to the U.S. So it is like a vassal state. It is like just even though, on the map it shows this is Germany, it's really just a territory of the U.S. Again, the decisions are being made back in the U.S. They're not really being made in Germany. Now, of course, there are Germans that are angry about that, and maybe they'll throw off the U.S. yoke. But at the present time, Europe is firmly under the yoke of the U.S.
Can you tell me what other countries are firmly under the yoke? I mean, we got Western Europe. Is it Australia, Canada, Japan,
Yeah.
South Korea?
Right. Okay, yeah, they call them the Five Eyes, the Anglosphere, but then also Japan. Japan has long been, firmly under U.S. control as far as, especially military questions. They don't dare to ever deviate from U.S. foreign policy and military objectives. South Korea, sometimes South Korea shows independence. It depends on who's in charge. The current president again is slavishly devoted to the U.S. He's like the Olaf Scholz of South Korea. So that's why we're South Korea supplied the artillery shells to Ukraine because the U.S. wanted them to, and it was not good for South Korea. Again, this was not what an independent country that's pursuing its own interests would have done, but that's what a vassal state does. But South Korea, I know there's a lot of criticism of this president in South Korea, and if the opposition party comes back into power, they may reverse course and start to assert more independence. I think there's more of an independent streak in South Korea than there is in, let's say, Taiwan or Japan.
Okay, so it sounds like the American Empire is quite a modern phenomenon. And really, prior to 1945, America was a completely different country.
Yeah.
Right. So these military bases, this happened immediately after 1945. I guess as a result of the Cold War,
right?
And so that created the military industrial complex and spread our military around the world. And then the Bretton Woods, was that 1971, or that's Nixon off the gold
Bretton Woods
standard?
1944.
Okay, right. So 1971 is getting off the gold standard,
right,
which kind of put a booster jet on the fact that we're the world reserve currency, and now it's not backed by anything, right? So it's really those two things that you think are define the American empire.
Yeah, actually, maybe should point to a third thing, and that is soft power. Hollywood and cultural influences. I think again, this power is waning also, but a couple generations ago, or a generation ago, it was just like U.S. culture, U.S. movies and music and so on, just completely dominated the world. And so you had countries where, well, even in the Soviet Union before it fell, it's just like all the young people were secretly listening to, U.S. music and wearing, affecting U.S. fashion, wearing torn jeans and that kind of thing. And he found it, even in places like Iran and wherever. Again, I think that, I know that influence, that power, which is really very real and actually quite important. We call it soft, but it can, when you control the minds and hearts of a people, you control those people. But that's fading. And, it was fading already before the recent wars, but I think it's, especially like in the case of October 7th, what followed, and the genocide in Gaza and the U.S. support. I know, for example, like in Iran, there still were a lot of people who were very favorable, especially young people, favorable to the U.S., which I find amazing after all that the U.S. has done to Iran. But you still had people who really believed in them. But this genocide has almost completely put an end to that phenomenon. I mean, that has been very damaging to U.S. soft power, to the U.S. reputation.
Yeah, I feel like U.S. soft power has really declined a lot in just the past, well, like you said, since October 7th, but it was already beginning to decline a bit. Right. I can just remember, when just being in China, just the first time in 2012, just everybody loved the fact that you're American. And then things started to go a little bit south. I noticed a shift in the mood after the Hong Kong protest in, I think it was maybe 2017, 2018, things started to change a little bit because people started to realize how the U.S. was getting involved in this type of stuff, and the people began to look.
It wasn't an entirely benign influence, right?
Right. So basically, you're saying there's kind of three pillars of American empire. There's the soft power, the fact that we're the reserve currency and our financial infrastructure, the SWIFT system, and our military presence around the world. Our military presence is still there. I don't think any bases have gone away, but our military power, I think, has been exposed to a large extent, has been diminished.
To a large extent, but not entirely. Again, most people in the U.S. aren't aware of it, and a lot of people around the world aren't, because again, even though, the power of U.S. media is declining, it's still very powerful. Just give you an example, your mother, is always listening to news from Taiwan. Now, when she goes out and she looks for her own source, she actually kind of finds an analogous source to the kind of, dissident sources that we listen to. But when news is pushed at her, it's just like the standard mainstream Taiwanese news. And it just reflects U.S. news entirely. So she's always saying, "Oh, do you hear like the North Koreans are now attacking in Kursk?" And I said, "No, they're not." But she's just getting stuff. It comes from Ukraine, goes from Ukraine to the U.S. and then is translated into Chinese and is sent off to Taiwan. And that's just true of many countries around the world. They basically their news is U.S. news. And so there are a lot of countries where people just entirely believe, the stories that are fed to them by the U.S. And one of the stories, of course, is that U.S. military might remains unrivaled, and U.S. weapon systems are by far and away the best in the world. And we know that that's not true, and people who get away from those mainstream Western sources know that it's not true, but there's still a lot of the world that believes that junk.
Okay, so can you tell me, maybe walk me through these three pillars and tell me how they're being degraded and the consequences of it for the United States? I know that's a little bit tricky, but you
Yeah,
were just kind
well,
of
I think
explaining.
okay, I touched on it. I was just talking about soft power, and part of it
Mm,
is what's happened in Gaza, especially that's had a huge impact in the Middle East and places like Iran. So I mean, there are a lot of people that used to look up to the U.S. as a moral force, a moral leader, and uh, they're looking at this moral leader is complicit in a genocide, right? And it makes them question too the U.S. support, of course, for Ukraine. They're told that um, you say, well, we just assumed that the U.S. was on the right side. Now they don't assume that anymore. I think that's you can point to a lot of things. I think that's actually I don't know what I would say about what preceded it. I think there's just been a kind of a gradual degeneration, kind of an increasing decadence in U.S. culture, and whereas a generation ago people sensed a real vitality and creativity. It's not that that's all gone, but I think it's fading in the U.S. And so we just don't have the edge in the creative arts that we once did. And increasingly too, they're just seeing, degeneracy, celebration of deviant lifestyles, and that may be for some, unfathomable reason, popular in the West, but in the rest of the world, it is not. They say, like, I don't want to look at this stuff, let's, so, that's soft power.
would you
Military
say,
power. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, so would you say that Israel has been by far the most damaging thing to the U.S. soft power?
Well,
Like it is
in the
really,
last year, no question about it. But over, if we're talking about the last couple of decades or something, there's obviously a lot more to it. It's not just Israel, and
mm,
much of it is just internal to the U.S.
right. I mean, with Israel, it's just because the United States has always been about human rights. We
Yeah,
always talk about that. We always talk about how we are, the rules-based order and human rights, and we're always championing it. And then it's just unbelievable that we stand by Israel and help them carry
yeah,
out this
yeah,
genocide while we still keep on crying on. We got to help human rights. We will get mad
yeah.
at people all around the world for minor things, the
Uh-huh.
little silly infractions that they say, oh, that's not okay. You can't do that. And then it's something that I think is really
Yeah.
exposed, just the
Oh, yeah.
hypocrisy of it.
Right.
And
And
I
there's
just,
also the hypocrisy of the support for the Ukrainians is almost as great. And I think people a certain part of the world is seeing that too. It's not quite so obvious. The contrast is not quite so stark as it is in Palestine, but it's there. Just to give you one example, the Ukrainians have been cracking down on the use of the Russian language. And it's something like, more than half of the people in Ukraine speak Russian as a first language. Even Zelensky himself, that was his first language, when he became president. But then under pressure, he's been, forcing himself to speak Ukrainian. It's not what his natural go-to language. But that movement against Russia precedes the SMO. It goes way back to 2014, even earlier in certain parts of Ukraine. So, this is something that's clearly in violation of what Western Europeans and the U.S. stand for. These are clearly human rights violations. And it's become very extreme now. There was recently a community in Western Ukraine has hired Russian language monitors who go out and just listen to people talking out in the streets, and they hear Russian. They nab these people. You can get into real trouble.
You can get in trouble just if you
Oh
speak
yeah.
Russian?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's at first it was like, okay, we can't use it in the schools, and you can't use it in the ROD, you can't use it in government agencies. But now it's just you cannot speak Russian, even out on the streets. That's what's happening. And it's a totalitarian crackdown. It's an obvious violation of human rights. Now, in contrast, in the Russian-controlled territories of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, Kherson, these places that are now under Russian control, the Russians have made it crystal clear that everybody has the right to speak the language of their choice. And if you want your children educated in Ukrainian in the schools, we will provide Ukrainian language teacher and Ukrainian language materials, that this is your right. And now, you would think that this is something that would warm the hearts of Western Europeans, and the US, but, they're just such hypocrites. And we can hide that fact from our own people, but much of the world is seeing it. So it's not just in Israel where, the hypocrisy is being exposed. It's also in Ukraine.
Right. I mean, soft power is all about telling the world what you stand for. And we always hid behind the guise of human rights. That's what we stand for. That makes you a good person. If you support human rights and you want everybody to have freedom and to live the life to their fulfill the best of their abilities. But it seems to be a sham. So now, like, is the U.S. trying to put something else out there, like what we stand for? Like, what does the American empire or the U.S.
They seem to be repeating the same thing. Well, except that now, the same kind of things that you would hear 20 years ago, right? So, we're about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all that, the things that we value and that are enshrined in our Constitution. But now there's a whole new layer of woke ideology on top of it. Gay rights, transgender rights, radical feminism, this kind of thing. And so that, that's actually, it's gone to the fore. It's like what particularly angered the EU about Georgia was the passage of the law against propagandizing, minors with regard to LGBTQ. And so that's what set them off. I mean, it's they talk about human rights, but for them, that's like the most sacred rights of all. And that just has not, the idea of freedom and is a popular idea throughout the world, but like transgender pronoun rights or something is not. You have to be within the hothouse environment of the West to actually believe in that. And obviously a lot of Westerners themselves don't, but you have to be part of that establishment, that ideological vanguard that really runs things here in the West and is trying to impose those values on the world to believe in that. The rest of the world just thinks it's crazy. And so, the more we push it, the more resistance you get.
Okay, so soft power is declining. We are trying to still hide behind this human rights guise, but in a large part it is the human rights focus isn't about people actually dying in Gaza or people not allowed to speak their own language or being persecuted for whatever reason it is. It's our focus is more on the woke ideology. That's our human rights kind of vehicle, more so, is what you say.
Well, that seems to be the main emphasis, and at the same time, we're just completely hypocritical about the other things. We obviously don't give a damn about the lives of Gazans or the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. It's just like we're very selective about the other kinds of rights that we champion.
Okay, and then so what about the other one? You were just about to jump into our military power as this pillar of American empire and its decline as well.
Right. Well, that's something we've discussed quite a bit here, so I won't go into any detail about that, just to say that, at one time, let's say in the 1990s, the U.S. was, the world's hyperpower, and not just, I think you could point to all three pillars, and it was certainly true. We had our military might was unrivaled at that time. We did have by far the most advanced weapon systems, and every tin pot dictator, every corrupt Middle Eastern government wanted to have our weapons and was willing to fork over many billions of dollars to have them. And so it was, with those weapons comes a relationship. It's just like it means becoming part of the U.S. Alliance. Even if it's not a formal alliance, that you're brought within the U.S. military empire and you're made part of it. And that's what countries around the world were very eager to do that. And some of them still are, but I think they're really foolish. Like, the Armenia right now is Pashinyan, I think, is the president there. And he's living 20 years in the past. And he's just so eager to become part of NATO. And he doesn't understand how the world has really changed. A lot of people, a lot of, political leaders don't. Again, it's just like consciousness, awareness of really lags behind the facts. But the facts is that U.S. military power is in relative decline and is being surpassed, by Russia, by China, and by Iran. That's one thing that we've seen. It's just clear that Iran figured out what they needed to do to fight a war in the 21st century. And we're still living in the 1990s. Again, we have a great air force for bombing poor countries. At a time when we didn't have rivals, that we had our equipment really was just spectacular. We could just blow up mud huts and everything wherever we wanted to. But now, these countries like Iran have figured out how you fight a war in the 21st century. And we're saying, we'll have to make sure to keep out of Iranian airspace.
Right. But it looks like we might really get involved in this war with Iran.
We might. I mean, we're allowing ourselves to be pulled into it. We're already involved. There's no question. We're already involved. We took part in that recent failure of an attack on Iran a couple of weeks ago. And I'm sure there are going to be future Israeli attacks, and we'll be involved again. And who knows, maybe in a bigger way. We said, right. Okay. Yeah, nothing to add there.
Yeah, let's jump into Iran in just a minute. But just to wrap everything up, can you talk to me about the financial power of the United States? Just recap the SWIFT system, the reserve currency status, and how that's playing out for the United States and the consequences for the U.S.
Right. Well, again, the SWIFT system is it's a payment system. I guess you're being really technical. It's a messaging system, between banks in different countries, but it makes possible payments across international borders. And over time, it became the international payment system. So if you wanted, one company wanted to buy something, import some kind of materials or equipment from another country, the payments would be made through SWIFT. If I wanted to send money to a family member in another country, I would end up making the payment through SWIFT. It's just how everything was done. So now the SWIFT is not based in the U.S. I believe it's based in Brussels, but it's under firm U.S. control. And so what the U.S. decided to use this system, its control over the system, to attack Russia in 2022 after the launch of the SMO. And they said they called it the sanction from hell. They were going to cut the Russia off from SWIFT. So that, they thought, well, they're just going to shrivel up and die because that's how people do business and they won't be able to do it anymore, right? Well, it created some problems, but amazingly few problems. I think partly Russia was preparing for this. They saw this coming years ago. So they had alternative systems set up. And there was a little hiccup, but then they just, a very brief recession in Russia. And then they just went on, continued to grow. And they found these alternative systems. They may not work quite as well, but I think over time they will. That's part of what BRICS is about, is creating these alternative systems. I think they call it, there's the BRICS bridge. That's basically the alternative to SWIFT. And then there's BRICS Clear, BRICS Pay, that's other aspects of the international financial infrastructure. And my understanding is they've started on all these projects. I don't know how long it'll take for them to complete them. But when these new BRICS systems go online, there will be, a fully functioning alternative to SWIFT. And, obviously BRICS member states can use them, but other states can as well. You don't have to be a member of BRICS to use them. And I think it'll accelerate this movement away from the dollar.
Will there also be, I guess, probably some advantages in the new system, and just in terms of transaction speeds and lower costs? The SWIFT system is actually pretty slow, and I mean, he said it was built
because it was
built
established
in the 40s.
Decades ago. Right. Well, the SWIFT, I think it wasn't in the 40s. That came along later. But yeah, I think they can. That's late developers often have an advantage, right? They can start from scratch and adopt the newest technologies. And I think that you're probably right. It'll end up even being superior to SWIFT.
Right. Faster, more secure, lower transaction fees. And really, that makes a huge difference in payments. People will just gravitate to what's easier. So we'll probably see adoption. It's hard to say how it'll go, but I'm sure old habits die hard. So I'm sure both systems will be operating for a while.
Without these BRICS systems, there's clearly a movement away from the dollar, a significant movement over the last couple of years, ever since the SMO, where the U.S. began to weaponize the dollar, weaponize SWIFT, and so on. The world saw that and said, man, we got to look for some alternatives. This is not, we always thought that this was just sort of a neutral currency that everybody could trust. Like this was a store anybody could go into and buy whatever you wanted, right? And we found out, no, it isn't. They just might nab you when you go into the store, and throw you in the back room. I'm keeping out of this store,
Right. And then take your money too.
Right.
But prior to 2022, I mean, the U.S. has been using economic sanctions for a while. So obviously there had, this isn't the newest weaponization of the dollar. Was there something specifically different about 2022? I guess it was the freezing of the Russian assets. That was something.
That too. Well, they had done similar things to Iran. But Russia is so much larger than Iran. So it's just like, my hat's off to Iran. I think Iran is the true pioneer. Iran is, if you kind of look like the whole BRICS multipolar movement, the leader really is Iran. They are the first ones to step out. And they did it kind of openly back in 1979. I remember that. And but they were just by themselves and easily demonized and against very powerful opponents. But they survived, and there was attempts to just destroy them through an invasion. The West supported a war against them. The Iraq invaded Iran. The West supplied Iraq with chemical weapons that were used against Iran. But Iran survived all of that, and then survived, increasingly severe sanctions over the years, and they really suffered, but they survived, and now they're not alone. I think the next big one, of course, was Russia, and that's made a huge difference to them. And China is still kind of on the fence. They're like, they're struggling. They're trying to keep, for I think obvious reasons, because they have so much trade with the West. They don't want to. They want to maintain friendly relations as much as possible, but they're just finding it increasingly difficult because of the unrelenting hostility from the West. So it's like if, leading the pack is Iran, and then Russia, and then China's in third, but there is this obvious movement away from the dollar and, away from Western hegemony. So, the sanctions, right? They've been used before, but just on a much smaller scale. The main target of sanctions before Russia was Iran, but Iran is, it's not a small country, but it's still much smaller than Russia. And it's just when they went after Russia, that was a huge mistake. Because I remember at the time thinking, well, if Iran has survived all these decades, of course Russia is. Russia's the largest country in the world. It's got more natural resources than any country in the world, and it's got a long border with the world's greatest manufacturing power. So what are they thinking? It's obviously not going to work. I thought they were going to be hurt, but it was just it hurt a lot more than they were. But obviously it failed. It was just it was stupid, like so many of the other moves that Western leadership have made in the last few years.
Yeah, so that's an interesting perspective. But I think it's true that Iran was really the pioneer.
Yeah.
Like every country, the U.S. uses these three things: its soft power, its financial system, the SWIFT system, its military might, to pressure and to make every country cower and adopt the U.S. system, U.S. ideology. And Iran seemed to be the first one that was the fly in the ointment that stood up and said, no, we're not doing this. And they survived. And once you've survived all that pressure, then there's no really putting that genie back in the bottle. It's out, right? It was gave the example to the world that, hey, we showed you that you can do it. And once you have survived, and your economy starts building and going up, then you're impervious. You don't have all these threats. It's so scary the first time taking this type of step, because you would think like, well, maybe they will just completely destroy us. We'll just completely collapse. And then they did. So it kind of showed the way. And now Russia has, and now you have Russia is such a large country. It really has changed the whole dynamic of the world, that everybody's able to look and see that, okay, there is an alternative now. You can stand up to the American empire. So I think the fact that Iran did it and now Russia did, that's really kind of the death blow to the American empire. That shows that, there isn't a one system anymore.
Right.
Is that fair to say?
I think it is. The American empire is still standing, but I think it has received its death blow. It's dying. Yeah.
Okay, and we shouldn't be scared that it received the death blow. That should
Right.
be good. We can get
It's
back
good
to
for
looking
us.
at the.
It's good for we Americans. It really
Right.
is. It's this. The empire is bad for us.